Hello and welcome back to Thoughts Per Episode Classic Doctor Who Edition. Today we will be talking about the serial The Time Meddler. If it has been a few decades since you last watched this serial, allow me to provide you with a swift and perhaps even accurate recap of events. The Doctor and Vicky land on a beach, and they do not yet know that they have taken Stephen with them from their previous adventure. He is kind of stashed on board the TARDIS. He survived at the end of the previous serial, and Vicky and the Doctor are very alarmed to find him there and think he might be some kind of terrible Dalek intruder until they realise that it's just him. Stephen does not believe that the TARDIS can travel in time, but over the course of the serial does gradually eventually come to believe it. As they exit the TARDIS and speculate about their whereabouts and whenabouts, they are being overheard by a monk. And I think viewers are supposed to be like, oh no, a monk of a time is hearing all this stuff about time travel, but that monk, he is the Time Meddler. I'm going to zoom out a little bit. Basically, this is set in 1066 when the Vikings land and cause a bit of a ruckus in human history. Well, I guess British history. They didn't affect all humans everywhere, they just kind of... Anyway, and the Time Meddler is this monk who has time travelled to the past with the intention of changing the course of events to what he deems to be a better one. Now let's address the thing I was not expecting. The Time Meddler is a Time Lord. He has a TARDIS. I mean, okay, it's never explicitly stated that he's a Time Lord. The words Time Lord still have not been uttered in the show. However, he's probably a Time Lord. He's got a TARDIS. He's got a... hang on a minute. A Mark IV TARDIS. And you know what's really interesting about that? And of course here we are getting into the territory of the lore is going to change as the years go on, because this was before box sets and the ability to rewatch old episodes on a whim, and they just thought, oh, we can just rewrite that or whatever. But what's interesting is it's kind of, you're supposed to believe, it's never outright said, but you're supposed to believe that the Doctor's TARDIS is something less than a Type 4. Or a Mark IV, sorry. Because we all know that the Doctor has a Type 40 TARDIS, which you would assume would be 36 iterations after a Mark IV. But when the Doctor learns that the Time Meddler has a Mark IV TARDIS, he's like, oh yes, well, okay, well you are, I'm like 40 years before you or whatever. But yeah, this episode got me really excited, because this is the first real evidence of Time Lord lore being written here. It's very exciting, and obviously the Doctor is a renegade Time Lord, but he doesn't really act like it here. He acts like, obviously, like, you could say he's a good renegade Time Lord and the Time Meddler is a bad renegade Time Lord, but he acts like, oh, this is yes, we come from the same place here now, and he's meddling in affairs, and he shouldn't be doing that. That is the golden law of time travel. As if the Doctor doesn't, meddle himself sometimes. In fact, I very recently listened to the Big Finish audio drama, The Beginning, which is Susan Foreman telling the story of her and the Doctor's escape from Gallifrey and the beginning of their adventures. And at one point, the Doctor is described as being a meddler. I don't know if that's meant to be a reference to the Time Meddler or not, but I like the idea that there's this, like, class of renegade Time Lord that's, called a meddler, and, like, they're hunted down and stopped from meddling in the laws of time and space. Anyway, yeah. By the way, if this video is a little bit shorter than normal, I didn't want to bring it up right at the start of the video to scare you all off, but I watched this episode about a week ago, so it's not as fresh in my memory as I would like when sitting down to record. The reason for this is because, as you may be able to hear in my voice, I have been ill this week and unable to record my thoughts, so that's a little bit unfortunate. However, I do still have copious notes to talk about. So if we shall now zoom back in and go through the episode. Oh, also it's worth mentioning, I watched the Tales of a TARDIS version of this episode, because that is a thing I'm going to do. If I approach a serial which has a Tales of a TARDIS version, I'm going to watch the Tales of a TARDIS version. And I feel like there might be some people who throw their arms up and go, no, why are you doing it like this? You're going to get spoilers from the companions talking about the ends of their journey and how their lives have been since then. You're going to miss some tiny little story beats which probably don't really matter, but as the pacing is adjusted for the modern version of the story, I'm okay with it. I'm absolutely fine with it. So in terms of spoilers, I learned that Stephen becomes a king and Vicky falls in love. That's all I know. And that's fine. That's interesting. I want to know how Stephen becomes a king. Don't tell me. I want to see how Stephen becomes a king. And yeah, maybe Vicky falling in love isn't the most fascinating and interesting turn of events, but, it'll be interesting to see who she falls in love with, I guess. If that's even a thing that happens in the show, or if it happens off camera afterwards. It does sound pretty similar to the Susan Foreman ending, but, whatever. I guess that's what happens in the 1960s. Women fall in love and men become kings. Speaking of that episode of Tales from the TARDIS, though, it was interesting how they handled William Hartnell's absence from, obviously, that show, because he's no longer with us, sadly. Man would be pretty old at this point. Man would be 116 today, by the way, if you were wondering. Something I really loved, by the way, about the start of the actual Time Meddler is the Doctor confiding in Vicky about how he was upset that Barbara and Ian took the first available opportunity to leave. I was quite surprised to see that, because the Doctor, the first Doctor anyway, is a very kind of closed off individual in terms of emotional availability. So it was really nice. I mean, I guess what they were probably doing was contextualizing what had happened for viewers who hadn't caught the previous serial, as this was airing weekly or whatever. But in terms of the narrative, it was really nice to see the Doctor actually sit down and tell Vicky, hey, I'm really bummed right now. He comes across as very insecure. Now, when we do finally meet Stephen, and Stephen kind of joins the crew, he keeps calling the Doctor Doc, and he's going, don't call me Doc! And all I can think of is Graham from the 13th Doctor's era, constantly going, what is it, Doc? What have we got to do, Doc? I guess she kind of is okay with it in that form, but not in this one. Now, to me, the Doctor yelling at Stephen not to call him Doc kind of gives me vibes of, like, there are some people maybe in the fan base at the time who might have taken to calling him the Doc, and maybe the writers were like, he's not the Doc, he's never the Doc. It felt like they were kind of trying to put the record straight. He is only the Doctor, or he is sometimes called Doctor Who, which is going to ruffle Christian's feathers in a few decades. Currently, Christian doesn't have feathers. Currently, his parents are babies. Now, one thing I noticed is that they can't actually be in 1066 with the Viking invasion, because that Viking helmet has horns, and as anyone who likes history even a smidgen should be able to tell you, the Vikings didn't have horns on their helmet. Anyway, Vicky is telling Stephen that the TARDIS isn't able to choose where it lands, and while Stephen still doesn't really believe that they're travelling in time, I think he takes his inability to ever return home very well. If that was me, I would be freaking the fuck out, but he's just kind of like, oh, interesting. I should take this moment to give my first impressions on Stephen as a companion, actually. We don't see him interact with the Doctor all that much in this episode, but we do see him interact with Vicky a lot, and he's quite bossy. He's quite, I don't know, he's, maybe headstrong is a better word for it. He's different to Ian, but in a different kind of a way. I don't really know how to describe it. He does sound a lot like a friend I have from uni, and that is very distracting to me. But yeah, it might take me some time to warm up to Stephen, to be perfectly honest. I don't dislike him, obviously, I just kind of miss Ian and Barbara. That's one of the things I'm most concerned about the next series, like William Hartnell's last series, because as far as I'm aware, I think he goes for another set of companions before his final tenure. And I'm just worried that the first Doctor adventures won't feel as good without Ian and Barbara, and from a while ago now, Susan. But hey, I like Vicky. I should allow them all time to grow and breathe, and maybe in a few serials I'll be turning around and going, oh, Stephen, don't leave. But I think because it's taken me so long to get to this point, Ian, Barbara, and Susan, and Vicky, I guess, as well, are very much emblazoned on my mind as first Doctor companions, and anyone else feels like a bit of a mismatch. Now, because Stephen is a new companion, he gets to bring up all the things that are going to be oddities to the outside observer who is not used to being in the show or watching the show. Very handy, that. So he brings up the fact that the TARDIS is disguised as a police box wherever it goes, and that doesn't really make sense. And you have to forgive me, I don't know if that's already been brought up on the show before. I think it has, though. But this is a very TARDIS-centric episode. By the way, something I noticed as well, the Time Meddler's TARDIS isn't called a TARDIS. It's only ever referred to as a time ship, which is interesting because Susan is the person who calls TARDIS the TARDIS. I can't remember if that's in the show or if it's just in the extended Big Finish lore, but she is the person who named the TARDIS, so it's a little bit weird to me in the future looking back on Time Lord lore and seeing that everyone has a TARDIS. Like, did it just catch on when the Doctor goes back to Gallifrey in a few incarnations? I don't know. It was probably lore that was either established earlier and will be forgotten in time, or lore which was only established later and was forgotten that wasn't the case earlier. I don't know. Are these small details important? Not at all. Do I obsess over them anyway? Yes, absolutely. Which is hilarious when I can't even remember what's been established in previous episodes already, and we're not even the Patrick Troughton era. Anyway, the Doctor says he will repair it one day. One day, Doctor, one day. At one point, the Doctor says it's a great pity that Barbara isn't here, and I agree. I agree, buddy. Pat, there, don't worry. You'll have plenty more companions in the future, plenty more people to miss. Oh god, why do I watch this show? So something I noticed is the Doctor goes on a little solo adventure here, and he ends up talking to himself a lot, and that's something I find interesting because that is a staple of solo Doctor adventures. Obviously, as a narrative tool, it's used for exposition, but still, when the Doctor is out by himself, in modern Doctor Who, those rare times when he doesn't have a companion, he monologues to himself as if he is talking to a companion, and I think that is a character trait with a capital C and a capital T, and therefore I'm considering it as being established here, and that's really cool to see. Next note, Stephen tackles a guy. Cool, good note, me. That provides so much context, and it sounds so important to talk about. Oh, here we go. Guy had a watch. So the first thing that we see about the monk not necessarily adding up, or events not necessarily being the way they should be, is we see that the monk has a bunch of modern technology. Now, of course, none of it looks like Time Lord technology. It's all very just modern technology from the 20th century, I guess. But still, there is a legitimate curiosity which is built when you watch the monk do what he's doing. You're like, why is he doing this though? Like, and the fact that he's got all of these, I nearly said gizmos and gadgets. The fact that he's got all this stuff from like the 20th century, and that like he's clearly got this plan in motion. Like when he got really excited to see the Vikings on the horizon, like at first I was like, oh, that's bad news for you. You're a fucking monk. If there's one thing I know the Vikings don't love, I've played Assassin's Creed Valhalla. I know how the monasteries fared during that time. But now he's just fucking jumping and hooting and hollering, and he's having a great time. And it's because obviously, you know, he's got this master plan to defeat them all, and it turns out he's got a fucking machine gun on a cliff. William Hartnell spends a good few scenes locked away in the monk's monastery in a little prison cell, and then he escapes, but we don't see him escape. That's weird. And then they have to find him after they find his escape route, Vicky and Stephen. And you know what this means? William Hartnell got a break. Good for him. It is very funny, all the contrivances that are used to give various actors breaks within the filming schedule of these old serials. And then most of my next patch of notes is me being absolutely astonished that the monk has a TARDIS. We've already talked about that.
And what mischief are you up to now?
Mischief? No. A master plan to end all master plans.
Oh, is that so?
Now, I know what you're going to say. Modern Doctor Who fan meets alternate Time Lord for the first time, assumes it must be the master in disguise gloating about a master plan. Now, I don't think the Time Meddler is going to end up being the master. In fact, I know he's not, because I kind of know the master's lore, and the Time Meddler isn't part of it, to my knowledge. Still, it's a fun bit of headcanon to be like, what if the Time Meddler and the Master are one and the same? Now, this is less about taking over the world or whatever, and this is more about changing the course of history for ostensibly the better, or just to be cheeky. Actually, I think it might just be to be cheeky, but you've got to admit there's something a little bit masterish about the Time Meddler, if not in terms of personality, then in terms of like what he is as a character and what he's doing. And just as I've pointed out Proto-Ood and Proto-Cybermen, I feel like the Time Meddler is very much a proto-master figure. Less villainous, less cartoonish, less cackling, less mustachy, but still the idea of what if the Doctor, but bad. Also, because I watched Tales of a TARDIS version, I am aware that they will run into the Time Meddler again. So I look forward to that, because I think the Time Meddler was actually a pretty fun villain when it all comes down to it. Not just because he's the first alternate Time Lord we've ever seen, but because he's, he's a cheeky little guy. He's a cheeky little gremlin guy who's trying to be cheeky. Of course, the Doctor subverts this plan by stealing the Time Meddler's dimensional control, which means his TARDIS is no longer bigger on the inside and he cannot fit inside. So So yeah, I think that's gonna about do it for me. Obviously, I didn't touch on every single thing about this episode. I did serial shit. I didn't talk about the characters that the Doctor, Vicky, and Stephen met in terms of like the villagers and like the Vikings and the little battles that went on or whatever. But I don't think we really need to, especially since I don't remember them all that well. But hopefully, now I will be able to continue making these thoughts per episode at a caliber I would like. Literally, it was so unfortunate. I watched this, or I watched the second half of this. I watched it in two halves. And then I was like, okay, cool, time to go to sleep. And then when I wake up tomorrow, I will record this. And I'm going to be super ahead of schedule as well and everything. And then I woke up the next morning feeling very ill. I was like, well, shit. So yeah, thank you very much for putting up with this voice. Hopefully next week it will be better or completely cured. I will return for the start of season 3. I almost said series 3. That's a weird thing. We've got to be weird about how we say that. Okay, so it looks like next week I will be talking about the serial Galaxy 4, which has been lovingly reconstructed in... Is that... Hang on a second. Is that... Oh my god, it's colour animation. I get to see colour! Oh my god! Oh, thank fuck. I get to see colour for once. Ah, it's going to be such a nice change of pace. Anyway, I'll see you next week.